a small but mighty crew this morning. We want to thank you for taking the time to come out about this ADA audit. Just to give you a little background on why we're here today. In 2010, the Department of Justice amended and created Article 2 of the 1994 ADA audit, and they really focused, or the ADA Act, and they really focused on this, on the next level, which was public and recreational spaces. And as part of that decree in 2010, they mandated that any government agency have an audit and transition plan. Well, something we hadn't done, so one of the things that was pretty apparent, also doing a quick walkthrough, nothing scientific but anecdotal, as I was walking through our park systems when I got here first. We could do better. So with that, we hired John McGovern from WT Engineering, who's one of the leading consultants in the nation on the ADA. He actually helped write some of it, so he knows a little bit about it. He's been doing this 20 plus years in different fashions. So we've actually had some of his team members actually go through every recreational facility that we have in the county over the past, at least since October. And he's here today to kind of summarize high level some of the findings, get some initial feedback from you guys, and help us finish out this game plan of where we're going to create an actual plan of, typically it looks at short, mid, and long term, that we kind of prioritize these things so that the county can budget for either some of the low-hanging fruit, or as we're thinking about redesign or redevelopment. An example is playgrounds. As we start to continue replacing playgrounds instead of just replacing the play structure, we'll now look at it through a different lens and make them better and more accessible to the entire community. So with that, John, it's all yours.
Thank you, Corey. So part of the community engagement piece is us knowing who we are. You all have the advantage of knowing who you are, but we need to have a record of who is here today. So could I ask staff to start and tell us who you are and what you do for the department?
Catherine Hudspeth, Community Services Department.
Corey Starman, Director of Community Services.
Linda Lindstrom, Office Manager, Community Services.
I'm David Hampton. I'm on the Parks and Rec Board.
Welcome, David.
I'm Ashley Reeder. I've been here since '94. So.
She was 4 years old.
Welcome, Ashley.
I'm Lisa Reeder, former member of the Parks and Rec Board, general community butt kicker. In this capacity as a parent of an individual with a disability.
Great. Well, welcome. And as Corey said, I'm John McGovern with the WT Group. I lead our accessibility practice. Before that, I worked in Parks and Recreation, started in Albuquerque, then worked in Illinois, and I represented our National Association on the 3 federal advisory committees that created the recreation content in the 2010 standards. So we know the standards pretty well, and Title II of the ADA is what we do most of our work in our experienced businesses and nonprofits, which are subject to Title III. They don't come to us unless they've been sued. But counties and cities frequently do this for the right reason. They want to make their sites more accessible and inclusive, and so they do proactively go out and evaluate sites and put together a transition plan. So appropriately, our scope of work addressed the Title II requirements. One, we had to do access audits of all parks and facilities. 2, we had to do community engagement. A key part of the ADA requirements, both at section 35.105 and 35.150D, is asking the community, what do you think the order of retrofit should be? What is your priority for types of sites? Is it trails? Is it playgrounds? Is it some of the unique sites that the department has? And then last but not least, we put together a phased retrofit schedule, which is called a transition plan. So it identifies what the deficit is at each site, what the several deficits are at each site, a solution to each, then who's responsible for barrier removal, then by what date. So Corey was referring to stages or phases, so we're likely going to group things in phase 1, which is relatively easy to do with current human and fiscal resources. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Then phase 2 is recreation assets that were new to the standards. And then phase 3 is more complex or costly retrofits. We also, in our scope, interviewed staff to find out what kinds of disability considerations they made when they were establishing policies and process. And then we also looked at how staff invite, analyze, and fulfill. I just walked out of your screen, didn't I? Invite, analyze, and fulfill requests for support from a person with a disability in CSD programs. So this is all we do. We're part of a larger company. The WT Group has architects, access experts, civil engineers, structural engineers, plan reviewers, land surveyors, a big presence in the telecommunications engineering market, aquatics engineering. But our team just specializes in this. So I have a Parks and Recreation background and a law degree. We have a registered architect on our staff, Jay Rhodes. He was the project manager for this project. Shelley Zuniga is a certified access specialist. That's the California professional credential. And Tanya Scheibe is a registered accessibility specialist. That's the Texas professional credential. Those are the only two states that have a professional credential for access. And it's probably the only things that Texas and California agree on. We have two staff who are certified ADA coordinators. Shelley is also a certified therapeutic recreation specialist. So, and 5 of our 7 staff worked in local government. So, not going to say we have been in your shoes to the Los Alamos County staff, but we bought shoes that fit the same way at the same store. So just a little bit about the ADA. Became effective 30 years ago, January 26th of 1992. And it provides protections in a number of areas. Title I addresses employment and broadly prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and employment. In 1990, when this was signed into law, 67% of people with disabilities were either unemployed or underemployed. 32 years later, it's 66%. So arguably, this has been the least effective part of the ADA. I think Title II, which addresses state and local government services, has by far been the most effective. Thousands of counties and cities and special purpose districts have evaluated their sites, evaluated their processes, put together a transition plan, and are doing this for the right reason. They want to make sure that people with and without disabilities can benefit from programs and services that improve the quality of life. Privately owned places of public accommodation, like hotels and the Starbucks I stopped at this morning and that massive Smith store. This is just my opinion. Businesses tend not to come to the ADA people until they've been sued. Unlike local governments. Local governments are much more proactive about this, but businesses don't think about this until they've been sued, which is odd because they can pay for it. There's both a tax credit and a tax deduction if a business will just simply step forward and put grab bars in the restroom or put a power door opener on the door into the store.
We need more of those.
We do. And with the $5,000 tax credit and the $15,000 tax deduction, a business could pay for it in 1 year.
Wow.
Telecommunications is also a part of the ADA, I should go back, but it's arguably obsolete because in 1990, not everybody had one of these, and today almost everybody does. So if I'm deaf or hard of hearing and I need to reach Corey about something, if I can track down his cell phone number, I can have a 4-hour conversation with him. Or I can use it to reach my sons, who will never return a phone call, but they will return a text. A little bit more about Title II. So it governs Los Alamos County services, parks, and facilities. So it certainly covers everything that the Community Services Department offers, but it also covers typical county business. So if I want to go make public comment at a county councilor meeting, and I'm deaf or hard of hearing, then the county has an obligation under Title II to facilitate that. The ADA also draws a really hard line, so this is kind of going to the trails discussion from earlier, between new sites and existing sites. If you build a new site, it must be fully compliant. So I got a phone call the other day from kind of a land management agency. They have trails that are not accessible because of the naturally occurring steep terrain. And they were replacing the halfway house, which is restrooms and a place to relax and water and stuff like this. So they said that their code guy said, well, we don't need to make it accessible because the trails leading to it aren't accessible. And of course, that's not true. If it's new, and new is anything built after 1992, it's got to comply with either the federal standard or New Mexico standards, whichever is more stringent. Existing sites, though, are completely different. Existing sites are subject to this vague Department of Justice program access test. So here's a simple example. If Los Alamos County has, I'm going to make up a number, Corey, 27 playgrounds. What do you think? Is making one playground accessible enough to say you've made the program of playgrounds accessible?
No.
I don't think so either. Should you be required to make all 27 accessible? In an ideal world, yes, right? So what's the right answer? And nobody knows the right answer because the Department of Justice won't give us a ratio or a percentage. We will tell the county, go with a minimum of 1 of 3 recurring assets. So sport courts, sport fields, playgrounds, trailheads, other recurring assets. Go with a minimum of 1 of 3 with the notion that in 2028, Corey talked about replacing a playground. In 2028, when a playground is replaced, if it's not on the schedule, it's a brand new construction, so therefore must be accessible. So now you're 1 plus over 1 of 3. So we know that this process works. The Department of Justice has accepted it. Department of Interior. In the final reports in giving the county this advice. We also follow a lot of smart practices, the last 2 words on this slide. The 2010 standards are 220 pages long, but they're incomplete. There are things about playgrounds that they don't say, like they never define the type of ground level play components. They never encourage you to have a designated entry, and you'll see in some of the pictures why this is important. So we do use smart practices that other counties around the country have used to make their sites more usable, and we apply them here. A little bit more about Title II. So this is part of the other scope element that we had. The county has to make its programs available in the most integrated settings. So whether it is swim lessons or golf lessons or after-school programs, those have to be available so that if I want to register my son who's on the spectrum with his brother who's not on the spectrum, that they can both be in the same program and they can both get the supports they need to succeed in the program. The county also has to make modifications to support participation. by people who have a disability. There's actually a list in Title II in the regulation, and it includes things that you might not think would be in there. So think back to COVID. Home visits is in there. A lot of parks and recreation agencies did home visits, even if it was just to drop by, go to the window, knock on the window, wave to the participant who has a disability, or leave toys or play equipment for them. So home visits, and libraries do this all the time. Libraries have done home visits for almost a century. Other modifications include provide more staff training, provide a higher staff ratio, provide accessible equipment, provide lift-equipped transportation, and so forth. The third bullet point's also important. Corey, you guys have some contractors / concessionaires. So a contractor or a concessionaire that's using county facilities to provide programs and services can't discriminate on the basis of disability either. So this has been driven home by a couple of court decisions, most notably in Florida, where the state had to go back to all 3,000 of their vendors and get them to rewrite their concession agreements to include non-discrimination on the basis of disability. So this is a pretty big issue for some communities. Last but not least, and this is kind of a nuanced issue, the county and all the other 89,004 units of local government can't make people with disabilities jump through a hoop that people without disabilities don't have to jump through. So we got a registration form the other day from a friend of ours who works in Parks and Recreation in New Jersey. And it said, hey, if you need a modification, tell us what it is, but then you have to call the Director of Parks and Recreation. Well, nobody else has to call the Director of Parks and Recreation. So that likely means somebody is going to be intimidated by calling the director and they're not going to do it. So steps like that, even though you might understand the rationale for it, go exactly against this Title II requirement. If there's room in the program and my Visa card clears, then I'm in. Is pretty much the rule here. So I talked about programs a little bit earlier. That's part of what the Department of Justice really focuses on. They broadly define what a program is. It is, of course, a thing that you register for that meets on Tuesdays from 5:30 to 8 and costs you $75 and runs for 8 weeks. But it's also me being able to grab a sandwich and sit at a picnic table in a park and eat it. That's a program. Sidewalks are a program that's been determined by 1, 2, 3 federal court decisions. So when you hear the term program, don't just think of a recreation activity. It's an opportunity that community services provides. The third bullet point is also kind of another nuanced thing. And we talked about this a little bit when we talked about playgrounds earlier. DOJ in black and white says that not necessarily every existing site has to be made accessible. So if this is the county and here's an accessible playground and the one over here is not, there's nothing wrong with leaving this one the way it is and inaccessible until it is next replaced, because this one is accessible. So this is all a matter of scale. Department of Justice doesn't give you a measure. They won't tell you if it's within a mile, it's okay to do it. So it depends on the community, it depends on the community's resources and a variety of other factors. It also depends on the features at that site. If the playground that's not accessible is some mega playground with all kinds of attractions, then that should be the one that becomes accessible, not the smaller one that has only a few things. The fourth bullet point is in regard to timing. So typically the county, especially since they're doing this on a proactive basis, can match the schedule to their resources. For a pure Parks and Recreation audit, we usually say take 9 to 12 years, depending on your resources. But if you're in a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice, you get 3 years. So you have to make every single deficit retrofit within a 3-year period, and that is really hard to do. I should have said this at the beginning. We've got the right size audience to make this interactive, so interrupt me, slow me down, throw in your own comments too. Trails. So let's talk about trails. Trails are really important, especially in Los Alamos and other communities like Los Alamos. But the problem is there's no adopted standard. There was a federal advisory committee that was appointed in 1998, worked through almost the end of 1999, and it addressed beaches, campsites, picnic areas, viewing areas, and trails, and constructed park elements like grills. We all reached consensus on everything except trails. Trails is the only reason that this hasn't been published. So right now, even though you can go online and order any one of 3 commercially available picnic areas or picnic tables, it's not part of the final design standard. So we suggested as a smart practice that the county adhere to the final writing of the U.S. Access Board. That's the small federal agency that sets accessibility standards. So they already tell you what an accessible trail looks like. They tell you what the 4 exceptions for trails are. So one of those is naturally occurring steep terrain. Another is meeting the technical requirements would interfere with protected species. Another is regulations regarding trail construction prohibit the importation of foreign soil or the use of machinery. And what's the 4th? I can't remember the 4th. Oh, spiritual and religious sites. So those are the 4 exceptions. And naturally occurring terrain, especially in an area like Los Alamos, is going to be the one that pops up most frequently. But within that, the general idea is you're supposed to generate about 1 of 3 of your trail miles that are accessible. So Corey, what we often recommend for agencies where trails are an important part of what they do, we're not going to tell you to spend $3 million retrofitting an existing dirt or grass trail, because dirt and grass are never accessible. We're going to encourage you instead to look in 2024 and in 2026 and in 2028 and see if there aren't other properties you can acquire that are flatter that you could make into accessible trails. So that's worked pretty well for a lot of the land management agencies that we've worked with. But this remains a source of frustration, and I'll also say kind of a source of some jeopardy for the county. Trails are a program. So Title II says the program of trails has to be accessible. But where do you go to find what that is? And so again, we're going to point you to the U.S. Access Board's final guideline, which governs only federally owned and operated trails, not federally funded trails. So we talked a little bit about this at the beginning. Why should you audit facilities? I think the important part is as you're making renovations down the road, you know what the list of issues to address includes, and you can incorporate that in your capital improvement plan. And also, candidly, a lot of sites were built before 1992, and let's be candid about it, access wasn't really a feature in the mind of most landscape architects and engineers and architects prior to that. But the bottom line is the best reason. It's just the right thing to do. Los Alamos County doesn't want to make sites available only to people who don't have a disability and exclude people who do have disabilities. So our process was pretty simple. We use an app. We used to lug around laptops, but we use an app and we've customized the checklist so we can go in and select New Mexico. We can go in and select the 1991 accessibility code. We can go in and select the 2010 code, and we can go in and select the outdoor recreation code for trails. And then as our auditors go through sites, and they're all experienced, they enter the deficit, and then there's a drop down that kicks in and says, hey, take a picture. So we then take a picture, and as we're gathering the information in the field, it's sending it to the cloud. Now I have no idea what the cloud is. I don't even know how it works. I don't know what it does, but it writes the report as we're gathering the data. So it's a pretty efficient system. I mentioned our smart practices before. We've incorporated those into the checklist. So Corey, when you see the final reports, you'll see some items that are called out as smart practices, not as a reference to a code. So some jurisdictions have said, you know what, we want to just focus on what's in the code. So that's certainly an option for the county. Simple tools, a smartphone, we use Androids, a tape measure, a door pressure gauge for facilities so that we can measure pounds of force, and a 2-foot digital level. We use a 2-foot digital level, not a 4-foot digital level, because if somebody ever files a complaint against CSD, they're going to come out here with a 2-foot level. So we want to have the same tool with us. It's kind of like going to a chili cook-off and bringing a can of Hormel. You're going to lose. So we want the county to be protected here. We believe in checklists too. Rocket scientists use checklists. Brain surgeons use checklists. This isn't rocket science or brain surgery, but we think the checklists help give staff a better view of what we saw and help us make sure that we capture everything. Part of the scope also included a statistically valid and reliable survey. So there's some pretty interesting, these are very, very preliminary results. You've seen this, right, Corey? All right, well, act surprised then, because this is very preliminary. 12% of households with disabilities reported that they or another person in the household had a disability. Households with disabilities were more likely than those without to use assistance with insurance programs and connect to home-based services. Households with disabilities rated the communication slightly lower than households without disabilities, perhaps indicating a need for better information sharing. A majority of the households with disabilities don't feel that anything would assist in their use of recreation sites, but a quarter felt that staff training would be more beneficial. So kind of a split result there. 75% though said they had no accessibility challenges with the community services department sites that they had used. And the bottom one's kind of an obvious one. People who identified as a household with a disability, they're more likely to identify improved access as something that would assist them.
I have a question.
Yep.
So for the purposes of this, how did you define disability? Because I just found it interesting that you said like 75% had no problems with access for the facilities that they use.
I think we asked them to define it themselves. We didn't use the
Standard.
Title II definition. So the Title II definition is, I'm a person with a disability if I have a health condition or disorder that has a substantial effect on one or more major life areas.
Okay,
So instead, we let people self-identify in the survey.
okay. Because I mean, like if you asked me, I probably would have more issues with accessibility, obviously, but.
Yeah,
So I just found that kind of interesting that 75% didn't have problems with accessing the places that they use.
I think that you could read that in a couple of different ways, though. I'm just going to suggest in my experience that people who have impaired sight and impaired mobility go to recreation sites less often than other people do.
Yeah,
So maybe that means the times they do go, it's because they know the site is more accessible, because it's been called out by the department. And so when they get there, there are fewer barriers because it's,
Because
I'm gonna say it's a specialized site. It's a
Yeah.
more compliant site and it's advertised as that.
yeah, okay.
But I stopped on the way here at Eastgate. I mean, that trail would be, I don't wanna go down that trail. So, I think, I like what you're saying, that, you know, maybe a definition would help narrow people in as far as who identified and who didn't, but we chose not to do it.
Well, and disability could be, being on the autistic spectrum,
Yeah,
which, no physical difficulties getting, into the pool or whatever.
yeah,
You just might need to chat with we don't do bear camp anymore, but one of the summer programs to say, hey, if Charlie starts acting like this, he needs to go, sit up here and be quiet, or here's some behavior management things, rather than a physical accessibility.
Well, and the the definition of disability was intended to be broad.
Yeah.
So there are court decisions today about service members coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder. They have a disability. For some reasons, persons who are obese can be classed as having a disability. If I'm obese because I like chocolate and Coca-Cola, that's not necessarily going to put me in the category of a person with a disability.
yeah,
So I think that was, part of some of the factors that we use to let people self-identify.
okay. Sorry, tangent.
Nope, not at all a tangent. Top 3 highest priorities for access improvements were trails, aquatic center. That's 4. Oh, libraries and picnic areas, they tied. The same list of sites and priority rankings would be visited more frequently if access to or in the facility were improved. So pretty simple stuff: aquatic center, locker rooms and showers, handrail the entire length of the hall. It's pretty hard to go swimming if you can't use the shower. Lumbar supported benches along some of the roads and trails, and easier to reach dog play areas. It is amazing to me how many times this comes up in communities. We'll have a community respond to the desire of the residents to add dog play areas, dog parks. So they'll put the big dog park closest to the accessible parking, and the small dog park 500 feet away. So that's not equitable. So sometimes this is a design issue. For the most part, we think accessibility is a function of 3 things: how it's designed, how it's installed or constructed, and then how it's maintained. And we're not here to point the finger back at the designer or the installer. And we will say in our final report too that our work is all about the future. I don't want to say we don't care what happened in the past, but in a way we don't, because we can't go back and change. But Los Alamos County has complete control over what happens in the next 10 years. And then we see this a lot as well in our community engagement work. People want accessible parking. People want buildings and restrooms that are accessible. People want ramps and handrails and automated door openers. You nailed that one.
Yeah, we don't have like.
So, and those are pretty, this could be from New Jersey, this could be from Washington State, this could be from Arizona, this could be from Texas. So we talked about what is a transition plan earlier, and I want to repeat that those are just preliminary results. RRC, the statistically valid and reliable research firm, they're still putting their final report together. So this is just a peek at some of the disability-related pieces. So one of the things that we're seeing in other jurisdictions is different factors in the order of retrofit. So I'm going to ask you 3 in particular later what you think yours should be, but one is the severity of the barrier. So if there is a park with a playground in the middle of it, dirt and grass are never accessible. So if there's not a route leading to it, that's a severe barrier because there's no way for me to get to it. We also see the flip side of that, and that's that people prioritize things that are easy to do, low-hanging fruit, things you can do with current human and fiscal resources. Like we will often see around a door the garbage and recycle bins placed here. So if this is an actual door that opens, that impedes maneuvering clearance. So that's not a cost. That's a simple staff layout drawing or a simple staff training about what not to put in front of the door. We've also seen a lot of communities start saying, hey, we think our highest priority should be our highest use sites, which makes sense. And we've also seen the fourth bullet point on this slide come up a lot. If we're going to spend several $7 million on this, we'd rather prioritize public spaces over employee spaces. Employee spaces are treated by Title I. The rules are completely different there. So it's not that the jurisdiction is not paying attention to employees who might have a disability, but they're choosing to, for the transition plan, prioritize public spaces. We also look at how recent construction is. I talked earlier about new construction has to be fully compliant. So if we find new construction that's not compliant, that's a problem because it violates the requirement that new construction be compliant. So we're likely going to suggest that's a higher priority. Repurposed sites. Parks and Recreation agencies often get the 100-year-old school that the school district doesn't want to use anymore. And so it comes to Parks and Recreation, and it's almost impossible to make accessible. So those tend to be toward the end of our list of priorities. Same for sites that have a partner. A lot of Parks and Recreation agencies partner with a YMCA or with a city if it's a county, or a Boys and Girls Club. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, but you've got to get the partner on the same page with you, which often means agreeing on which portion is going to be paid for by whom. And then, as I talked about earlier, just complex or costly retrofits, those take time to build up to. A couple of others, sites not yet subject to a design standard, so that could include trails. As I told you earlier, we're going to treat trails as a smart practice. So there are going to be places where we recommend trails are not in the last stage of priorities. Technical infeasibility means if this is a load-bearing element, and for me to make, if there's a restroom here, for me to make the restroom compliant, I'd have to move the load-bearing element, then I don't have to do that. So that that means you're going to look somewhere else for that particular asset to be compliant. Historic sites, there's a misconception that historic sites are exempt. They're not. They have to be evaluated. But before you do any work, the list of the work you're going to do has to go to the State Historic Preservation Officer. And that office is the only one that's authorized to say that the work would threaten or destroy the historic significance of the site. So we see a lot of agencies, though, choose to go ahead and make access happen anyway. Chicago made Navy Pier accessible, took it off the historic register because they wanted the billions of dollars in economic impact that it generates a year for the city. They did the same thing with Soldier Field. It was on the historic register. It now looks like a UFO landed on top of a Roman Colosseum, but they generate more money for the Chicago Park District. So there are, I don't want to say workarounds here, but there are ways that a jurisdiction can approach historic sites and do something different. I talked earlier about sites with other protections, so that comes into play here too. If there are sites with protected flora or fauna, and meeting the technical requirements would trip over those, then you don't have to do that either. So let's look at some of the things that we saw at community services department sites. So parking, and again, this could be New Jersey or Washington or Illinois or Iowa or New Mexico. Parking is really hard to get compliant. The 2.08% is a hard slope to reach, especially in a terrain like Los Alamos County has. Here though, the picture on the left, there's no accessible parking provided at Camp May and at Brewer Arena. At Ashley Pond, I think even you can tell from the image here that the parking stall and the access aisles are too steep. They're at 3.5%, the max is 2.08%, let's say 2.1%. So that's pushing 1.5 times the dimension. Accessible surfaces that are in disrepair, by that we mean it's got a gap of greater than 1/2 inch or a change in level greater than 1/4 inch. So we did see those, but again, we see those in a lot of communities. I will say here, we've seen the private sector come up with a pretty effective solution. So for just that access aisle and parking stall, they'll pour concrete. And then the rest of the lot, they'll make it asphalt or crushed stone or whatever they want to make it. So concrete's a little easier to get fixed at a certain slope. So if you ever go to McDonald's or drive by a Hilton, pull in and look at their parking lot. So there are two companies that have kind of taken this on. Hilton because of the settlement agreement with the Department of Justice. Accessible routes, I think I talked to Jay about his general impressions, and I think one of the things, Corey mentioned 2010, and that's a really important issue. Before 2010, when playgrounds and sports fields and other things like that, arenas were addressed, I think we knew dirt and grass weren't accessible, but it wasn't in the standard. And it is today. It's a big deal within the standard. So you need to have something besides dirt and grass that leads to Brewer Arena. Loose gravel can't work unless it's compacted and it's crusher fine. So the Bio Canyon and the excess cross slope, that's at 2.7. Actually, that's at 2.3. If that were a slightly different surface, that might be a pass. 15.1% slope here though, that's too steep. That's much higher than the 8.33% that's permitted. In parks, we saw some assets that lacked accessible features, like at East Park and North Mesa. If you're going to put a picnic table there, at least one of every, let me think about this, it's 5%. So one of every 20, or a minimum of one, have to be of an accessible design. Same for the water fountain. You've got to have a high-low bowl, number one. Number two, I've got to be able to wheel right up to it and approach it from the side, whether I'm going to use the high bowl or the low bowl. We saw a couple of top lot issues too, where we understand why there's a border around the top lot to keep the surface in, but that border effectively keeps me out if I use a mobility device, a wheeled mobility device. So this is the importance of the notion of a designated entry. Carving out something here about 8 feet wide, making it flush with this, and then all you do is focus your maintenance on 8 feet instead of the whole perimeter of the play area. So that's one of the things that's missing in the playground guidelines that we always include as a smart practice. More about parks and play areas. We think this is an installation issue in the far left. Transfer systems cannot be higher than 11 to 18 inches. So that allows me, if I have the ability to do it, to wheel up here in my wheelchair, either stomach first or belly first, and then go up these steps and then use the playground structure. But if it's at 21 inches, I'm not going to be able to get up there. So this could also, though, be a maintenance issue. This could be the engineer wood fiber surface is too low. And so maybe that's why there's a 3-inch variance. At Urban Park and Ridgeway, play surfaces have loose materials. We think sand has great play value. We're not saying eliminate sand. But there's got to be a route that connects at the playgrounds that you're designating as accessible. There's got to be a route that connects accessible play components. Indoors, we rarely see a perfect bathroom. So here, the lavatory, the sink is too high at 30, let's say 35 and a half. It should be a maximum of 34 on the left. Lack insulation, and the insulation is important for me, a wheelchair user who may not have feeling in my legs. You don't want my legs up against a pipe with hot water in it, or a pipe that's got material on it that's going to abrade my legs. Unique site, mini golf, rodeo. So the elements have obstructions. So I did stop at Eastgate this morning. There's a pretty clever design here where with the right amount of force, those will roll over and you can just wheel right past them. Obviously they're there to keep the ball from going from hole 1 to hole 5. So they have a definite purpose, but there are ways to hinge them and make it so that it's an accessible course. The stadium had a handful of issues: accessible parking, the accessible route, I talked about that already, and then seating at both the Horse Barn and North Mesa Park and at Brewer Arena. So that picture on the bottom right, and this is a pretty common thing for us to see at arenas, and it's just not a compliant surface. Dog parks, we talked a little bit about dog parks earlier. The rule with dog parks is you got to get me in the door. There's probably dog waste, bag dispensers there. If there's water there, it's got to be accessible. And then within the dog park, if there's a sheltered area to get out of the sun, there's got to be a route to that. So here we've got lack of an accessible route at East Dog Park and at North Mesa. Gates have to meet the requirement that they open with less than 5 pounds of force. The gate latch has to be no higher than 48 inches. It's got to be on a firm and stable surface, and a handful of other requirements. Trails, so again, like we talked, we're going to treat this as smart practices. The cross slope on Canyon Rim, where we were at here, it's 2.6. So, you know, I'd probably say in the range of things that we saw, this should be 2.1. 2.6 is probably something that's livable, especially since this isn't a final and enforceable standard. And I can never pronounce this, the Kinnickinnick Park. I got it? All right. There's no accessible route to the trailhead, and it lacks trail slope and distance information. Unlike Eastgate. Eastgate's got that great map that talks about each trail, and that's part of the requirement. That's part of the access board requirement, is that you tell me on your website and you tell me at the trailhead how far I can go before I have to cross a gully or go up 400 feet in elevation. So that kind of information helps me make the decision about where I'm going to go hike that day. So those are just samples of what we saw. You're probably going to see about 4,000 pictures in the reports. But as we talked about at the beginning, the role of community members is really important. I might have a disability, but I don't have your disability. And so we want to hear, what your feedback is as to what the order of retrofit should be. And it's consistent with the whole idea behind the ADA, that don't do anything for us without us. So I'm going to stop and talk, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to talk about what's next. Site facility audits were completed. Our RC Associates has completed and is putting together the final report on the survey. We'll deliver the final reports to you. You and I should talk dates today for all the reporting, but certainly within the next 30 days. And then staff continues implementation. There are a lot of things that we saw at a lot of the sites that are good examples of accessibility. But for now, what are your preferences? Do you have, is there a type of an asset that you think should be accessible more than others? Is there a location that you want? Do you like the idea of busiest sites? Are there other factors that you'd like to throw out? So, the floor's the three of you.
Well, the biggest thing that I've noticed with this count is that, like I said, the automatic doors are absolute lack thereof. So that would be, and that would be one of those things where it's a relatively easy fix and you could do it in, several, like pretty much all the just like the downtown places.
What are you speaking about, private companies or public spaces?
What do you mean?
So
We're-
like Starbucks is a private space.
Okay.
And so this conversation is about the public spaces, the county spaces.
Yeah, the parks and facilities and
Right.
libraries and trails.
So the places that you go that are public,
Yeah.
like Fuller Lodge had an automatic door, but they had it propped open for us this morning. The pool has an automatic door, the library has an automatic door,
Yeah.
the municipal building has an automatic door. So I think your automatic door ones are fairly well covered in the county facilities.
Okay, so it's just with the, Okay.
Yeah, your issues have been more with private facilities,
yeah,
right?
okay.
What about, so are we only talking physical location, or are we talking programming as well?
The transition plan is intended to address physical
Okay.
issues. So everything from signage for persons who are blind, location of signage, to whether or not there's a ramp, to the pounds of force to open the door, and so forth.
So one of my elderly friends has mentioned the municipal building, the distance from the parking into the building with no handrail was a concern for her. The parking is right there, and the ramp is right there, but you go down the ramp, and then there's a very long stretch until you get to the door. And that was Joanne, that was something that she.
That was the
noticed.
city hall.
Yeah, at the municipal building.
So what about county sites?
Well, we are city, county, municipality, they're all the same.
Oh, it's site.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know if they did the meeting, I don't think they did the meeting building when they were here.
I don't think it's in the list.
No, and truthfully, she has mentioned it to Ann, and Ann said it is compliant, but she still complains.
Okay,
So she needs to use a cane and
sure.
would prefer a handrail all the way in.
Yeah, 'cause this morning I drove by fire department and a couple of other, what looked like city buildings, not county buildings.
Yeah, well,
But it's all the same.
yeah, it's all the
Yeah,
same.
Right.
We're city, county, municipality.
Yeah.
We're type H, part H, type H municipality. Is the only one in the state.
And since we're with a small group, if you've got program ideas, please share those with us as well. 'Cause
Yeah. Well, and that's because I sit on both sides of that fence. I absolutely understand the difficulty in keeping trained people on staff to provide absolutely every service for absolutely every person with every documented disability in a community our size. It's not feasible. But how to get the communication out there, I believe I told you at one point, our aquatic center story, we had an issue where Ashley's physical therapist took her swimming. Yet, a member of the county at that point felt that was going against the anti-donation clause of the state because the
Right.
physical therapist was making money on county property providing a service to Ashley. So he said, all right, who have you got that's gonna go swim with Ashley? Well, they don't have anybody that can go swim with Ashley. So we addressed that all the way up at a county council meeting, because that isn't any, the anti-donation clause makes it really difficult in this state and the interpretation of that, because then it got down to the high schoolers that are providing Wednesday after school babysitting, take their little charges over to the pool. They're making money on a county facility. The anti-donation clause messes things up for providing services to people with disabilities. It really does. It makes it so that I could not hire somebody when Ashley was in elementary school to take her swimming until we got the rule changed. And
So that's a barrier.
it is a barrier. It's a legal barrier to finding decent workarounds.
And in my mind, it's more complicated than that, because I've been trying for a couple of years to get, because we've had the anti-donation clause, which was designed for railroad companies over 100 years ago in the state. That's part of our constitution, and it's never been litigated. So we were trying to get the county to do various things, like for instance, donate the land to the Los Alamos retirement community, and that leases land. It's only $43,000 a year, which it's not significant budgetary wise, but it's one of those situations like, okay, well, let's do things which might cause a litigation, so we can find out what the intended limitations are for a constitutional amendment that no one who created it is alive anymore, right? So we don't know. But every time we try and do anything in the county, the anti-donation clause comes up.
And it tends to bite the nonprofits or the people attempting to do good things in the butt. It doesn't bite Kroger in the butt. It bites people trying to provide therapeutic riding programs or services to, where we're trying to do sort of a family, not even a workaround, but provide as a family, and that's a huge barrier. That's been a huge barrier. And in a small community, it's an even bigger barrier. And we now have, thank God, Atomic City Transit, but the LA bus system before, which was funded 90% on grants to provide services for people with disabilities and did not provide those services.
Would never pick me up for
I know.
things I needed to do.
I know. But, so the county has come up and we now have Atomic City Transit, which has been a huge game changer for Ashley. But trying to figure out workarounds on the anti-donation clause is, I think, a big thing. And that's a legal thing, and if that's advice that you can provide as well.
It's not.
What about you, lawyer?
I don't do criminal law, I don't do wills and trusts, and I don't do New Mexico law.
New Mexico law is very challenging. We're talking about water law, no. But trying to figure out how to be fiscally responsible yet and flexible enough to provide services for, there's only, when Ashley was growing up, there were only 3 kids in town in wheelchairs, and they had not a whole lot they could do.
Yeah.
And the schools were much better at providing things. But we had some lovely collaborative things. You were talking about the playgrounds, and if out-of-the-box solutions in a small community that's complicated. So Ashley, what else in town would you have wanted to access? It was mostly programs. You went to the Bear Canyon summer camp, and that was when you were mostly using a walker, and that worked okay.
Yeah.
Because they put on an extra teenager to tool around with Ashley and make sure she got to the bathroom okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure, because
What would you have liked to do, particularly growing up, that was harder for you because you used a wheelchair? Ashley Pond used to be very difficult, but now you're all over Ashley Pond.
Yeah. Ashley Pond's a lot better now that
That it's been done, but Ashley gets there straight from her apartment, she doesn't have to park and go, because you are correct, unless you park over on the Trinity side, and even then, it's a hard, from the Trinity side, it's a hard workaround. But she just toodles over from her apartment and goes across Central and down.
Ashley, what do you think about this first bullet point? Start with the basics. So if, I talked earlier about an example where there's a wonderful accessible playground in the middle of the park, but it's surrounded by grass and dirt.
Yeah.
So the basics would mean accessible parking, entries to buildings, restrooms,
That's true.
accessible routes.
That's important, yeah.
Because when you go to Ashley Pond and you have to go to the bathroom, where do you go?
Well, now there's actual bathrooms.
The one down below,
Yeah.
and you can get in and out of those, okay?
Uh-huh.
Do they have an automatic door?
No, they don't.
Yeah. No automatic door to those bathrooms.
Yeah.
So you have to have somebody actually open that door for you to use those.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that one's an important one.
These are the changes we made to the permitting fees process. Does that allow someone to go swimming in a pool with,
Oh yeah, that was you knew Jim West. He got on a major soapbox with the council, and yes. So now anyone who needs an aide or an attendant or any sort of professional service at the pool in particular, he actually got so if Petra went swimming with her again, Petra wouldn't even have to pay the entrance fee. I did sort of disagree with that. I was perfectly happy to pay Petra's $3.50 to get into the pool, but.
and I'm just thinking from a bigger
Yes.
perspective, with what we went through with
Oh, with the 1735?
yeah.
Did we address that in 1735? Fees for,
Like for people giving lessons in Brewer, in the arena,
oh, for,
private
but for
contract.
people with
No.
disability, I'm sorry, that we're on the disability thing though?
Well, I just mean overall, so you can still, whether it's with disabilities or not, I think
Yeah,
we took care of that, right?
For the arena, we have the professional license thing. That was
Yeah.
different.
But-
I don't know if that, we did not address that at all.
But I think it
for any
applies to all
facilities.
county facilities, right? To
Yeah.
a certain degree, yeah.
So I've had a hard time actually pulling up 1731 and printing that out lately. But yeah, I didn't
well,
look at that with a disability mindset of that when we were working on that.
Well, I'm just saying, so, I mean, if you look at it just from the mindset of anybody getting private contract, whether it's assistance or lessons or anything, I think, they just have to get the permit from the county, right?
well, yeah, but again, the policy is if you need assistance, we'll figure out how to help you find assistance. It's not an additional charge. Now, it's different if you're having a class and you've rented that facility. I think at somewhere in the, I'll have to check, I think the facility agreement does state that you can't discriminate on anything for anyone in an event. But if you were holding a class, there would be incumbent on you to not discriminate as part of that agreement.
So could I run a yoga class in a park and charge people separately for it?
Yeah, you just have to get, for that particular thing, all you have to do is, if you want exclusive space like a pavilion, you have to rent the pavilion, and you have to have an instructor's license, which is like $150 a year.
Do you make them have a credential in that practice too? So if I'm doing horseback riding, am I certified as a therapeutic horseback riding instructor?
So
We're
this
working
is-
on that right
Yeah.
now, so yeah, that is one of the things, but since you're not contracting with me, if you were contracting with me to do the service, I would want you credentialed, but if you're doing it as your own
Just a
person,
business contract?
I'm just doing you with the space.
Okay.
So the other question I had on the, you can't discriminate, okay, on the basis of disability. So I provide riding lessons.
Good.
I do not have the training, this is totally hypothetical, because I actually do have the training and the former certification, but I don't have the certification in therapeutic riding, therefore I don't feel safe opening my program up to people with disabilities. Am I allowed to, can't do that.
Can't do
So
that.
anyone providing any service whatsoever in a concession agreement with the county,
Well, leaving that part out, anyone that opens their doors to the public and charges them a fee for material or space or lessons, if I take you to the park with a bag of golf clubs and show you how to pitch onto the green and charge you $50 for it,
we have to let Ashley come too, if she wants to.
and if she wants to play golf, then I can't say no.
So, I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but as a lifelong horseman and someone who has in the past been certified for therapeutic riding, there are people that I would say, I cannot accommodate you. It's not safe for me to accommodate you. Is that still considered discrimination if you base it on safety? I do not have a horse that can
It's a
accommodate you,
narrow-
or,
There's a narrow limitation if somebody poses a direct threat, not to themselves, but to others. So if I'm on the autism spectrum and you're worried about me riding the horses up and a horse bucking a kid off of its saddle, and you have incident reports, you've got to have objective data. So if you have incident reports of that having happened before, then you could make the argument that I pose a direct threat. But the direct threat can't be to me. Congress was really clear about that. They said, look, we don't want people to make a decision on behalf of a person with a disability. But state statutes tell you you have to keep everybody in your program safe.
and,
So I think this is a non-disability issue.
Okay.
It's just about running a program that's safe for all participants.
okay,
But direct threat is limited to me threatening you. Like if I throw my phone at you during lessons, or pick up a saddle and chuck it at a horse, that's a direct threat.
okay,
But me, okay, I've seen horses skitter because a piece of paper
I
goes
know.
across the floor.
Great.
But me throwing a spitball at a horse is not a direct threat,
okay,
for the most part.
okay. That's
It's a rabbit hole, you're right.
it's a big rabbit hole, and it's a liability, it's a huge liability.
Well, interestingly, there's no,
So the idea would be, let's say, you wanna come and take riding lessons, and I have 3 horses, but I don't have a horse that can physically accommodate you. Or I don't have a horse that is well trained enough to stand for 15 minutes at the mounting block, because that's about how long it takes you to get on and get situated.
Yeah.
Okay, so I, as an instructor, do not feel that I can safely accommodate you without potential injury to you or to my horse. But what I'm hearing is, unless it's an injury to my own person, I can't really,
well, I mean, when you first came in, you talked about science.
yeah,
There's gotta be objective data.
Okay.
It can't be based on, like, I know a lot of kids who are on the autism spectrum. A small number of them are aggressive when they experience communication issues. I can't treat the other 95% as if they're gonna be aggressive and act out.
right.
So unless you've got a stack of incident reports,
But my own personal incident report, not a national survey kind of thing. So if somebody has to get hurt in my program before I can
there's,
decline to
I
serve
mean,
them.
in the playground safety world, there's a network that collects emergency room data that tells you what the most frequent cause of injury on a playground is. So there's nothing wrong with using that, but it's gotta be an unbiased,
Right.
objective data source.
Wow, we're gonna have some fun with our concession agreements. That's gonna be real hard. So, not so hypothetically, Ashley can show up at the swimming pool and start taking her chair down the ramp to the therapy pool, and if she electrocutes herself, that's her problem.
No. The aquatics industry has for decades had pool chairs, so it does require that you transfer whole idea of pool stairs that are narrow are really intended for somebody who has Parkinson's or extreme arthritis to use to enter the water. So there's just not a perfect way to
Right.
enter the water.
Right.
Pool lifts are probably the closest, but a lot of people think that they look pretty undignified swinging bottom first out into above the water, then into the water.
You know, I don't know, we have this discussion often, sometimes your dignity goes out the window if you wanna do something, and it's the same in the healthcare industry. At some point, it's like, it is possible for you to get into the pool this way or this way. If you choose not to get into the pool this way or this way, and those are our two options, I mean, would the county then be required to provide option number 3?
It depends on what option number 3 is. The Department of Justice says in the Title II regulation that was published in 1991 that lifting, and I remember this phrase because it's so odd, lifting is manifestly exceptional, and it is reserved to only the times when you're picking somebody out of a wheelchair up and putting them into like the conning tower of a submarine. So there must be a city somewhere that's got a retired submarine that they use as a tourist attraction, because I've never once seen anybody lift somebody out, put them into a conning tower.
Oh my goodness.
But lifting is prohibited for a bunch of reasons.
Yes.
It's bad for you, the employee. It's bad for the person you're lifting if you drop them.
Yep. Or not trained to lift properly, absolutely.
Correct.
Absolutely, but using the chair transfer, you know, the swing chair, okay, it might be undignified, but everybody in the pool that way, I don't know. I mean, sometimes it gets ridiculous, and like I said, I sit on both sides of this fence. So Ashley, are there any other sites that you would like to be easier to access? Okay, so let's put, so when you went to vote last year, whatever year it was, did you have any trouble?
I don't think so, there's an automatic door, right?
Yeah, we went down the ramp, we parked, and we went down the ramp, and we had the automatic door, and then the lady was very happy to give you your sample ballot and give you a hand, right?
Yeah.
The pool is very accessible, the library is very accessible. I would say the library, depending on where you park, is accessible.
Yeah.
Once you park on the east side, getting in, the sidewalk is really narrow, and that part is squirrely. But when you go to the library, the ladies are always really helpful, and they have the automatic sliding doors and stuff, so that's easy.
Yeah.
So, I will say going to the rodeo is challenging. I think, the grandstand, so we were also part of the group that helped with the redesign of the grandstands at Sullivan Field way back when. And you just put a little grandstand like that in there with the cutouts and the ramp and not take the whole big thing down. The parking is tough. But the restrooms, down there, the flushing restrooms are bad, but the ones down by the indoor, the vault toilets are easy. I mean, as long as you keep the, between the concrete and the gravel level.
We're seeing an interesting trend in park restrooms that it started in New Jersey, it's spread to Illinois, it's in Texas now, where the simple fact of the matter is you're gonna have an adult who uses a mobility device who weighs 135 pounds and is 5'6" tall. They're not gonna fit on the typical changing station. So New Jersey, Texas is considering it, so is Illinois, is installing an adult-sized changing table, which enlarges the size of the park restrooms. So that's not here yet. It's not, and it's not even in 5 states yet. But I think that that's the kind of thing that will get feet and gain momentum. We're also seeing some other changes. I don't know if you drive a hybrid car, but electric car charging station. So that's different too, and that's not part of the current federal standards.
Right.
Or the New Mexico standards.
Well, I will say that the vault toilets, the size of the vault toilets, the placement of the bars on vault toilets, the fact that you can get a wheelchair in and out of those, and an extra person, because, you know, I mean, even some of the regularly accessible bathrooms, it takes two people, you know, Ashley and myself, or Ashley and her aide, you know, in the bathroom. So to have the size of those vault toilets, I think is great. You know, everybody can use those.
So for priorities, my personal opinion, it seems like the high use things would be the busiest sites, I think would be my top priority. I mean, for instance, souping up Ashley Pond, for instance, like if it's, and the, after busiest sites, then the basics, I like that concept. So in other words, to get the automatic door opener for the bathrooms. Those bathrooms, you know, they seem to be working, so. But that being said, so what about trails, right? It's different. That's gonna be a toughie, but I mean something like Camp May, right? We're already identifying there's no parking access, there's no picnic table access. You know, I think one of the conclusions is we'll probably have to put in more trails, right? Somehow, because we have an overabundance of trails, right? But
I think that that's a solution. Instead of you trying to correct the naturally occurring terrain, find terrain. Now, I just made that sound really easy. Find terrain that's relatively flat and create trail loops there. We just did an evaluation for a Tucson suburb, privately owned golf course. The private owner sucked all the money out of it that he could, stopped paying his bills. It's Tucson, so that included the water bill. So the course went to pot, and you've got neighbors who have spent $1 million to $1.5 million on golf course property homes. So the owner then goes to the town and says, hey, can we rezone this as residential? So that made all the residents furious, and so they raised $1.8 million, bought the golf course, donated to the not the Nature Conservancy, the Nature Foundation, I believe. The Nature Foundation is donating the golf cart paths to the town for use as trails. So you talked about, you know, out of the box thinking. That's out of the box thinking. So they hired us to evaluate the golf cart paths, which candidly were pretty good. We found 2 stretches of 25% each that matched the trail requirements. So that's a great way to look at this. So, you know, maybe it's an old big box store that isn't going to be around after it closes again. That might be a site for you for trails or something like that. But I think that that's a better approach than trying to carve up the hills that you have these trails in.
So do they have to be paved to be considered
They
accessible?
don't have to be paved. It can be paved, planked, or crusher fines, not stones,
Pressure fines,
but
right.
crusher fines. And if it's crusher fines, it's going to be more heavily maintained. There are some types of trail tread treatments that involve for lack of a better word, a congealing agent. So that's effective also with some types of shredded wood fiber and other surfaces. So the U.S. Access Board has done a fair amount of research on trail surfaces. They've found some that work, they've found some that fail. The Department of Interior ran a pilot project using congealed playground surfaces in Wisconsin, I think it was. And it didn't work, but that was 15 years ago.
So in terms of trail surfaces, unless it is actually paved, it would not be a trail that you would want to have mountain bikes or horses on.
If it's a trail with horses on it, it's not a pedestrian trail.
Okay.
And if it's a trail trail with the bikes, it's a really more of a shared use path.
But a mountain bike is not going to tear it up. I mean, like I said, I have horses.
I'm gonna yield to the mountain bike experts. My own guess would be that a mountain bike would require more maintenance than pedestrians.
So the best thing then would be a paved trail.
Yeah, and another challenge we have up here for crusher fines is if we put it into making sure that it's snow plowed, the crusher fines just totally deteriorate, so that's even another consideration that we have to.
Where my mind was going with this is something out Quadri Mesa, but you know, on the utility road basically, but it would have to be very well designed to keep, you know, if it was just a portion of it.
But we are, you know, when we talked about this urban trail that's gonna connect Canyon around across town down to the aquatic center.
Yeah,
We've talked about that, so it's beat to death about making sure that it's accessible.
accessible and it can be plowed.
Even looked at the interpretive signage through this area to make sure that that's accessible. So that'll be another trail that is accessible. One of the first ones that I saw here that's really neat and I'm blown away with is you've got the Sombrio
Yeah, well,
older
back there.
facility, and you got East Mesa Park Trail, and you gotta go down almost a straight drop to get onto the trail, and then it goes down at, I don't know what they got it figured out, but that's one that we need. Those are the first ones I said, well, we should address this. This is one we already have. Relatively little effort. Oh, by the way, why did we mess this one up? Because there's a community of people here that probably have difficulty accessing this. So I think that's part of the conversation, and we've also looked at, is there a small loop we can create in Picnic Park that's an asset for our community as well as peak? So I
Well,
think those
that's one of the things that we recommended for the Tucson site was creating trail loops through what was the golf course before. And the access board, I think you asked, I'm gonna paraphrase, but you asked, what's the best surface? The access board goes out of its way to not tell you what the best surface is, because you can have a loose surface. It just requires you to maintain it more. And they expect you to know that going in. Don't pick a loose fill surface unless you're gonna commit to twice the maintenance. But pick it if you wish. We've had Florida County that we're working with now. Their trail surfaces are crushed shells. And they go out and compact them every week, and it works. It's a firm, stable surface. And they have plenty of shells in
But
Florida.
they don't have to
You
worry
don't have
about plowing in the winter.
No, and they don't have that. They do have nesting sea turtles, which causes a host of other issues, but you don't have that issue on it.
Well, hey, we really appreciate you guys taking the time this morning to come share your thoughts. And again, we find this important to improve our accessibility for our community, bring us up. And again, we appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for having it. I will say my only negative comment was this did not get advertised really well. I started sharing on Facebook, but would have liked to have really gotten the word out a lot better. I hope we have better Zoom.
Yeah, we sent this out to everyone that had participated in our previous meetings. We also sent it out.
Remind them.